In this lecture, I'm going to cover the cephalopods, which I think is one of the most interesting groups of mollusks. It's pretty interesting that these kinds of animals actually belong to the same phylum as critters like clams and snails, because cephalopods are usually really fast-moving. They're active carnivores as opposed to filter feeders, and they show some really amazing and complex behaviors, including the ability to remember and learn. Cephalopods are exclusively marine, and this group includes the giant squid, which weighs up to 1,000 kilograms, perhaps over 2,000 pounds at the largest estimates, and can reach lengths up to something like 18 meters, which is incredibly, close to 60 feet long. I think a lot of the specimens of the giant squid have been closer to about 15, 20 feet long. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about those guys. And then there's also tiny ones that are less than a couple of inches. So there's a really huge diversity. And this picture shows squid on the top left and bottom here. The only shelled cephalopod, which is a couple species of Nautilus, and then an octopus over here. And the thing that I don't have pictured right here is cuttlefishes, which are also cephalopods. Okay, so cephalopods, like other mollusks, all have a radula, they have a mantle, they have ctenidia, and they have a foot. But these things don't exactly have the same form and function as they do in many of the other mollusks. Just want to talk briefly about Nautilus. Again, this is the only group that has a shell, and a lot of the extinct species of cephalopods had shells, and so the Nautilus is very sort of primitive, ancient-looking kind of cephalopod. There's only 5 or 6 species in this genus that do have a shell. So they have this spiral shell that's divided into a number of different chambers. As I mentioned, Nautilus are active carnivores like other cephalopods, and the tentacles that you see here are really a modification of the foot. So the arms on the octopus, or the tentacles on the squid or the octopus or the Nautilus, again, are basically how the foot has become modified for this very active carnivore type lifestyle. A shell that again is divided by these septa. You've seen that word when we talked about the segmentation in annelids. So this isn't really a segmentation in the same sense, but it is a division of the shell into these different chambers. And the living animal is only found in the outermost chamber here. And then there's this calcified tube called the siphuncle. All right, let me just highlight that for you a minute here, the siphuncle. And this is this calcified tube that will penetrate through the septa and through all of the chambers and just spiral around all the way to the interior. Okay, and so liquid can be transported from and to the shell chambers from the siphuncle, and gases may also diffuse in and out. So this allows the Nautilus to sort of alter the amount of liquid versus gas in each of the chambers, and can change the buoyancy of the animal. And this allows it to change its position in the water column. So they may undergo these really huge vertical migrations, and can descend thousands of meters and then reascend that same distance each day. This picture of a cross-section of the shell really shows those septa, as well as where the siphuncle, at least the calcified part of the siphuncle, is maybe still present in this no longer living specimen. So here's a couple of different species of squid here, just to talk a little bit more about some general characteristics of cephalopods. One is that they have incredibly good vision. They have well-developed eyes, they can form images, and as you might expect, this goes along with their active carnivore lifestyle, where they need to be able to see prey that they're chasing after. As I mentioned before, the foot is divided or modified into these tentacles. Here you can see the mantle, which has this outer covering, and then the mantle itself can form a tube or a siphon like it does in other mollusks. And in this case, the squid can move very quickly, and other cephalopods can move very quickly by jet propulsion. So they can force water out of the siphon in a very quick way, and this will allow them to skirt off really, really fast. Something that's unique to the cephalopods that's different than the other mollusks is that they have a closed circulatory system, unlike other mollusks that have an open system. So since they have a closed system, the blood flows entirely through the arteries and veins and capillaries, and they don't really have the blood sinuses that you see in the other mollusks. They also have a systemic heart, and they have some accessory hearts called branchial hearts, and these are hearts that allow blood to be circulated to the tenidia. So when you think about this construction of this closed circulatory system with the branchial hearts on either side and then a systemic heart pumping blood quickly through the animal, especially around the gills, is that bringing oxygen to the gills for a very active animal is one of the things that this kind of system accomplishes. So you have this active carnivore lifestyle supported by its physiology, right? That form and function thing that we keep talking about. So you've got blood pumping around the gills and water moving through quickly, and these guys just being very active, having good vision, this closed circulatory system, and these large tenidia that can absorb oxygen, again, all support this kind of a lifestyle. So one of the most famous mollusks is this giant squid, or sometimes called the colossal squid, called Architeuthis. And here's one in a museum. So there are a few preserved specimens. These guys are deep water animals, and not that much is known about them. You often see, if you Google these guys, you'll see these sort of fictional images, and I want you to realize that this is not a true photograph or an image. It's just kind of the imagination of people that have long speculated about these sea monsters that were squid-like, that could capture whales and turn boats over. And so they're pretty much deep water organisms, and I'm going to provide a link to a very interesting TED talk that shows you more about this, the early images of this animal from some deep water photography that has been extremely challenging to get. So take a look at that video as well. The skin of cephalopods contain several layers of these tiny cells that have different colors, and these cells are called chromatophores. And chromatophores are these pigment-containing cells. Okay, and they also have these other cells that are called iridocytes. And these cells contain these sort of crystal-like materials that allow for reflection. Okay, so chromatophores can give these animals their color, whereas the iridophores will give them a sort of a reflective sort of iridescence. Some cephalopods have photophores, okay, and the photophores actually can provide light. Okay, so these guys can bioluminesce if they have the presence of these photophores. All right, so let me go back to the chromatophores for a minute, because that's what's actually pictured in this slide here. And what happens is that chromatophores can expand and contract, okay, and that any cephalopod may have hundreds of thousands or even millions of these cells, and they're mediated by muscle elements in the skin, but they're also under direct nervous control from the brain. So you have innervation going to each cell, and the brain can kind of pick up images, and then the animal will quickly contract some cells and expand others, and this can cause them to change their color and patterns extremely, extremely fast. And so in the next slide, you're going to see contraction of a chromatophore. So remember, these are in layers, and this one cell on the top here, that's this big yellow blob, you'll see in the next slide has contracted down into a denser color. And here you see that contraction so that you can see how maybe like a spot would be formed if many chromatophores are expanded into a light color and some are contracted into this dark color. So they can change their color and patterns extremely fast. They use this to match their background for camouflaging. They can use it for courtship. They have defenses. And I'm also going to post another video that will show octopus that are just masters of deception in terms of how they can change the texture of their skin, the color of their skin, and the patterns of their skin to really fool predators. This slide shows both an expanded and a contracted chromatophore at the same time. And here you can see the cells and the kinds of patterns that may be created with chromatophores of different pigments and different extents of contraction and expansion. I wanted to just show this slide again to point out some of the features that I mentioned before, but also that you can see the funnel, which is really a modification of the mantle, also called the siphon, as we mentioned before. And another defensive feature that cephalopods have are inks. So here's an ink sac. So an octopus or a squid can squirt ink out at a potential predator when they're swimming by as an additional defense. So again, the name cephalopod, right, brings up the connotation of being cephalized, and of course the cephalopods, and especially the octopus, have the most extreme extent of concentration of nervous tissue at the anterior end, or cephalization, of pretty much any other invertebrate on the planet. So they have this large, complex, and differentiated brain, and this has certainly provided amazing capacity for these animals to be able to learn, to memorize, and again, if you think about how that goes along with their active carnivorous sort of lifestyle, many of these guys will live in dens during the day, and then they'll go out and forage within a particular territorial area at night. So they have to kind of learn the geography and the spatial setup around the area in which they're foraging. So they may memorize where a particular coral head is, or where a rock is, or where some other organisms are growing. And so they have a fairly complex, it's likely that they have a fairly complex, what's called a cognitive map of the area in which they live. So they go out and forage, and then they bring mollusks and other kinds of invertebrates like crabs and things that they eat back to their den. And it's pretty interesting when we've been snorkeling or diving in the Turks and Caicos and have located an octopus den. Because we dive during the day, we don't see these guys out very often. But we do see a den area, and you can recognize it as a den because there'll be this pile of mollusk shells and pieces of crabs just right out in front at the entrance. And then if you shine your flashlight down in there, sometimes you're lucky enough to get a glimpse of the octopus itself. This very famous study shows the results of the capacity for octopus to learn, not only just by being able to be trained to do something, but that the more astounding thing is that many octopus can learn just by observing other octopuses. Okay, so on the left here, we see that the octopus chose a red over a white ball, and they were sort of negatively trained with a mild electric shock. I don't want you to think that they were cruelly treated. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that these guys published this study not that long ago, and so they went through animal rights committees and stuff, and so a very, very mild electric shock was provided. It was 1992, I believe, so that they would learn to avoid the white balls and choose the red balls. And so what we see is that you can train them to choose white over red or red over white on the left-hand side by training. But what's really remarkable is that some octopus that were not trained at all, but just were hanging out and were able to watch the other animals choose a ball, that they learned to choose red over white or white over red just by observing. And what's really remarkable is that it took them about 17 trials on average to learn by training, but it only took them about 4 trials to learn just by observing. So the remarkable capacity for these animals' intelligence is only really just beginning to be understood because they're more difficult to study. And many can solve mazes, and they may even have powers of intelligence way beyond what we know for dogs or even chimps, but because they're difficult to study, it may be hard to actually completely uncover all of their abilities.